Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Green. I am the president and CEO of Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, or PACE. Most of you know this already, but just as a quick refresher, PACE is a robust community of funders who are working together to strengthen American democracy through active civic participation. And it is very much our belief that we need funders to think long term, to anticipate change, and to invest proactively in the future of American democracy. And that's why we've been so proud to host the Democracy Futures Project with generous support from the Packard Foundation. And really happy to have had the opportunity to go on this learning journey with all of you over the past 18 months. One of my favorite quotes from this entire process is this one, and I think it really speaks to the need for this project and why it has been such gratifying work to engage in. And that is, the greatest risk to democracy is not authoritarianism alone. It is the unexamined assumption that the only futures available to us are small tweaks of the present. So, what we have tried to do throughout this process is to really expand our horizons in terms of the futures that we can imagine for American democracy. And we're going to have a chance to get into all that with you today. So, one ask from me, we are not going to have time for everybody to verbally introduce themselves, but we would love to know who is engaging in this webinar today. So, if you don't mind in the chat, please say who you are and what institution are you representing and anything else that you would like to share. We know most of you, but some are newcomers to PACE and to this space, so we really welcome you. And the second thing is just to talk a little bit about the goals for today's session. So we are going to review and reflect on some of the, small procedural learnings from the Democracy Futures project, but also on some of the big lessons and sort of macro provocations that we have arrived at through this 18 months journey that we've all been on. And we really want to bring you all into that process with us. The second is that we want to engage in a discussion about some of the implications of what we have found in doing this work and pressure test a couple of big conclusions that we have reached. We like to say at PACE that we work things out together. So we're going to work out some of our key findings and provocations with you all today and see if you think that we're on the right track. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Starr.
All right, Shannon, thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to spend about maybe 10 or 15 minutes just doing some very quick high-level setting about the work that we've done over the past 18 months. I had the honor to be involved in this as a collaborator with Kristen, with Shannon, with Kelly Bourne as a member of the organizing team, and I played a role as a facilitator and designer of each of the sessions. So just very quickly, and the project goals that we really had for this engagement was more than anything else, it was to provide democracy funders, the participants in the process, with their new ideas about how to work with futures and foresight tools and frameworks, and therefore how to kind of build and expand their capacities as funders. So that it was really a capability building exercise more than anything else. But then as we went through it, we also wanted to make sure that the work was, as we were working on democracy futures, was imagining visions for democracy and basically identifying some of those ideas and innovations that might get us towards more promising futures as we were dealing with kind of difficult times at the present. Oh, next slide, please, Kristen. So with those as the goals, very briefly, the project overview, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. Many of you who were involved in this process are very familiar, and we'll go into some of the kind of the details as we went through. As we provided tools and frameworks to help futures and foresight thinking, we structured it broadly along this kind of four-part process. We started by opening up and exploring using techniques like horizon scanning. And that really involved examining various different megatrends, we'll talk about it in a moment, that we believe that are shaping democracy both today and are poised to for 25, 50 years into the future. So we started by kind of exploring what this all could mean. Um, the second workshop in March 2025 then tried to make sense of some of those trends by creating a set of scenarios, these alternative visions of what the future might look like, which then allowed us to explore possibilities for what this means for democracy, both potentially its renewal or potentially its erosion. In the third workshop, we then moved a little bit from exploration into what I'm going to call application, where we brought things a little closer to home for democracy funders. We looked at visioning exercises from regions, from Wales, from Dallas. We thought about a three horizon framework to think about what's the appropriate way in which we as democracy funders should be kind of conceiving of support for democracy work. And then we also reviewed kind of existing democracy innovations. All of that, both exploration and application, then brought us to a capstone workshop back in September, where we synthesized a lot of the learnings and developed potential opportunities for collective action from people who have participated throughout the process, and hopefully for others as well. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because this is something that Kristen and Shannon are going to delve a little more deeply into in terms of our insights around this. But if we wanted to kind of just put, okay, what were the main takeaways? What were the main lessons? Some of these are not surprising. We're operating at the moment in a time of fast-moving, unpredictable 21st century challenges. Um, our institutions and our practices around democracy have been designed sometimes for hundreds or 200 years ago, but they're certainly designed for a pre-digital era. Um, it's no surprise to say that democracy has to evolve to kind of remain relevant. What exactly that means is not just that we need to transform everything, but we need to think about what is it that needs to be transformed along with important core principles that remain with us over hundreds of years. Our sense is that philanthropy is anchored in the present. We'll talk much more about this. The vast majority of resources that are funding work around democracy futures or around democracy tends to be defensive work about the status quo and current challenges, leaving experimentation and long-term planning underfunded. We also, I think, concluded that the importance of imagination. Visioning processes, we saw this in many of the people we talked to, are essential to kind of building public legitimacy and energy for reform. There is so much that we talk about regarding changes in electoral practices or changing in democratic practices. Visioning processes seem to be at the heart. We've got to imagine what the future might and could be. To Shannon's point of earlier, it's not about just these tiny incremental changes. It is about reimagining what things could happen. We also talked about how there is not one development or technology that is going to provide a full system solution here. Ecosystems matter. We're going to be connecting innovations. We've got to be thinking about how things really, many democratic innovations have to go hand in hand with others. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, I think a main takeaway was that as funders, we have to see ourselves as futurist change agents. Um, our role, if we believe that democracy is challenged and democracy needs to change and it's anchored in the present at the moment, we need to be thinking about bold experiments, supporting local legitimacy, and creating conditions for communities to define their own futures, which I think that last one there really did give a sense of empowerment to all the participants in the process to say, yes, we might have learned about futures and foresight ideas, but really about making it happen is the next most important part of this. Next slide, please. So if that was the kind of the quick review of the work that we did, I thought it might be helpful just for 5 minutes or so to offer some reflections on with someone who myself who's done a lot of futures and foresight work. How did democracy funders engage with the futures work here? What was our experience of it? And what lessons can we take if we think about moving this forward as futurist change agents in the months and years to come? I'm going to start just with maybe a reflection on horizon scanning. I talked about how when we began this project, we looked, thanks to a lot of external guests and speakers, at several different megatrends that are playing out and poised to change things. And you could look at them there on the screen, whether it be biomedicine, bioscience and medicine, um, uh, aging demographics, gender changes, climate change, international relations, and so on. It certainly seemed to us that artificial intelligence, maybe because of recency bias, or it seems to be the almost dominant mega trend of today. And it both kind of formed to be a trend in itself, but then also was a kind of cause of other changes. And so as the project continued, only a few of these trends seem to kind of stay with us at the potential for the staying power to capture our continued attention. And I thought that was interesting, both because I think if we'd had like more time in the exploration, we might well have connected a number of these things together. As it was, I think artificial intelligence almost became a proxy for the fact that things are changing in very significant ways, and we could see the relevance of AI for democracy either as an enhancement to it or indeed as a challenge to it. So artificial intelligence really did, I think, loom large over a lot of the work that we did. Next slide, please. The observations here, obviously, if you create a lot of ideas around megatrends, you have to try and make sense of them, and that's one of the purposes of scenario planning as a technique within foresight and futures. We created these four scenarios. We've been through them in virtual sessions before, so I'm not going to go into the details of what these four stories were. Essentially, they told different stories about how the US might evolve in terms of its structure, in terms of its values, in terms of its power over the course of the next 25 years. I think as we reflected on the scenario work, it seemed as if it was difficult for groups to envision a lot of plausible positive scenarios. Sometimes we wrote them up as being things that AI was creating, or maybe a value shift because of significant climate change threats and so on. And so I think it was worthwhile reflecting on the fact that it was difficult to imagine plausible, positive futures for groups. Not impossible, but I think just people had a tough time imagining what plausible possible futures were. They didn't have a tough time imagining much more, let's say, problematic ones, and that's worthy, I think, of comment and exploration. I think also groups definitely more readily recognize the possibility of scenarios that involved greater government and corporate power, including more surveillance. The network state scenario was one that people felt, yeah, I can imagine that playing out in the future. And then maybe the final point about scenarios here is that we created these and they were reviewed back in March of this year, at a time when I think people's minds were very much based on the craziness of the first few weeks and months of the incoming administration. And it does pose questions as to almost throughout this process, we were trying to push for a long-term perspective while also having to deal almost on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis with the fact that things were changing around us in very challenging ways. And I think it does behove us to think about what is it that can allow us to kind of step out of immediate concerns and park immediate concerns to allow us to do this long-term thinking. Uh, Next slide, please. Just a couple of other reflections here on, let's say, the kind of the experience of engaging with futures material. I mentioned how if the horizon scanning and the scenario planning was very much about exploration, thinking about the big mega trends, what life might be like in 2050. In workshop three, we then had to balance that stretch with kind of bringing a little more relevance to it. So we used futures tools there to bring things closer to the experience of democracy funders. One of the ones that really did kind of, I think, hit home for people was the value of the three horizons model. And I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with this. The idea that um, it's worth conceiving of the way in which we think about our work in terms of three different horizons. The first one being, let's say, Horizon One, where we're talking a lot about immediate concerns and business as usual, and it usually is a defensive posture. Horizon Three is much more reimagining what could be possible in the future, and that will involve a lot more kind of visioning processes. And then Horizon Two being the experimentation that gets you effectively from one until three. And so this value of the three horizons model, people kind of saw in their own organizations. Oh my goodness, yes, I can see that we may need to shift between, various different components of that model. I think they also value the kind of the practical experience of visioning processes. We brought in Jerry Hawkins from Dallas. We brought in Sophie Howe from Wales, and there were many other processes mentioned. And I think people kind of valued how is it that we should kind of go about doing visioning processes. And then we also thought about a number of, let's say, current democracy innovations and engage with stories around how we might see these play out in future. It was another form of scenario planning, helped there by Gideon Litchfield, who joined us. And I think people really did engage well with the kind of the creation of the scenarios that Gideon put together there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, finally, maybe top level reflections on the experience here. This was a very difficult time to do long-term thinking. As we know, as democracy funders, as democracy practitioners, we were constantly challenged with the day-to-day news. And I think participants valued the space and time to think about these longer term issues at a particularly fraught moment. Um, any futures work that you do, I think valuable futures work involves hearing from new voices. And so bringing perspectives in who could talk about bioscience or talking about gender, who could talk about economic policy making, as well as democracy, I think was well received. People also recognized that the scope of what we were doing was challenging. These were different long-term futures for the US. Who knows where that might go in the years and decades to come, and then thinking about the democracy implications of it. So people were challenged, I think, a little bit by the scope. But then finally, and you can see in the slide in the table there was very much at the end of the process, people saw the value of this and they wanted to bring futures frameworks and techniques back into their own organizations, whether it be incorporating into strategy, sharing what you learned with partners, sorry, sharing what you learned with colleagues, and then continuing their own personal learning and skill building. So I wanted to just stop there and offer those reflections as someone who has done a lot of futures work and to say there were really kind of in, there were significant kind of benefits, I think, from doing this, even though it was a very, very difficult time to do it. And I wanted to kind of open it up now for either, well, two responses. I guess responses from those who might have been in one or more of the workshops or involved in the virtual workshops. What were your experiences, let's say, of engaging with the futures tools that we did? And then also, anyone who is coming at this a little more with kind of fresh eyes, maybe you've engaged with futures in different kind of in different projects. Again, what would you add to what I've put there, or what would you kind of contend with and say, oh, this is my experience, or I think I've got something else that I would to contribute. So let me see if anyone's got any reactions to what I've provided there in terms of the experience of going through futures work in this project.
Jonathan, I can break the ice as somebody who went
Shannon.
through a futures project for the first time. Um, on your point about how hard it is to get into the mindset of being able to engage in futures
Mhm.
processes, that's what really struck me about workshop two. We were
Mhm.
all drinking out of a fire hose in terms of all the changes that were happening at the federal level. And it was very difficult to shift from all of that incoming and processing everything that was changing to thinking really downrange and expansively about the future. And so it did have me wondering whether there were some exercises to like train your brain or at least help your brain transition from that short-term mindset to a mindset where you could really think in that really bold, expansive, and over the horizon way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Shannon, I think definitely there are some ways in which how can you give people a much more kind of visceral experience of getting into the scenarios. But yeah, I certainly observe that and would love to hear from others around this.
Looks like Emily has her hand raised.
Yeah,
Emily, did you want to
yeah,
respond to this or
yeah,
did you want to bring
yeah,
in something else?
It is right in line
Great.
with this thread. So I think that there is, in response to the question or the provocation that it's difficult to imagine positive futures.
mhm,
It was difficult. I agree that it is, and it was. Um, But I want us to I would argue that we want to resist the notion that it's just simply a matter of, geez, we need more imaginative people, or we need to be more imaginative.
mhm,
Because let me give you a sense of where I think futures work, big picture, sits in the theory of change.
Mm.
Uh, that and I've thought a lot about this since even really
mhm,
workshop two, and it's only recently that I've kind of refound the language. Um, Systems thinking for economic systems anyway has there's a framework that says, like what you want to do when you imagine a better future is what you're doing is you're steering between two extremes. You're steering between utopianism on the one hand and small c conservatism on the other hand. And
mhm,
utopianism is the idea that it's like I'm going to pick and choose the attributes of the kind of society I want to live in, and I'm going to bundle them all together as if they don't. It ignores when it's at its worst, it's ignoring the
mhm,
fact that certain things go together. So, for example, you can't have both everybody being polite to each other all the time and have freedom of speech. You can't have both those things. That if you're going to have a principle like free
mhm,
speech, you're going to have to also have forbearance and toleration for things that we don't like. So, and it turns out that there's a lot about liberal democratic society that is like that. That if you want core principles to be in play, you can't then also say that there's this other set of things that you want to package together. It's like liberal democratic society is a package, has these sort of package deals associated with it. And so the utopianism forgets that and just kind of, puts the Christmas
mhm,
tree ornaments that it wants on the tree without thinking systemically. Why that's a problem is because when you then try that out and society it turns out it's not workable, well, what do? This is why dystopian fiction is so valuable, is because it's like, oh, everybody reverts to or defaults to illiberal means to get the perfect, and so that undermines the core principles that would have
yeah,
left us in a liberally democratic environment. The problem with conservatism, in one sense, is to say, I'm really scared of that. I'm really scared of that utopianism. So I'm just going to like hold on to what we got, and because any visioning is going to sound like utopianist thinking. And so I think that's the
mhm,
problem with conservatism, small c conservatism on the other side, is that, and so futures work when it's at its best is holding that tension, and it's sort of like it's trying to do the work in the midst of that tension, but that tension is really, if understood, can be workable, right? So in other words, it should be hard to envision a better one of the positive futures because there's a binding constraint. It has to cohere. It has to be a workable system. It can't just be shit we like. And so that requirement of systems thinking should make it hard. And so that's what I want to warn against, that it's not just our failures of imagination. I think it's a feature of futures work,
Yeah.
that positive scenarios that are different from our current state should be hard. So embracing it as a feature, that difficulty as a feature, not a bug, and it's not a sign of our deficiency. But I do think that in our process, we've failed oftentimes to really hold ourselves to that sort of systemic thinking, that a workable liberal democracy is a package deal that will come with things that
Hmm.
in the moment we won't like.
Yeah.
So
Love it.
that's kind of how my thinking has evolved really since workshop two. Hope it's
Very
helpful.
good. Emily, thanks so much. I can see a couple of other responses. Bobby and then Suzette. Bobby?
Um, yeah, so this is all fascinating. I have not participated in any of these workshops, but we do use similar kind of techniques like every day in our practice, Three Horizons in particular, and really helping people see themselves as stewards of a future they most want to create. And so the one point I guess I'll pick up on, one of the themes about the interconnectedness of this is it can seem when you lay out sort of these alternative paths, like the divided nation, has a very different complexion from the democracy
Yeah.
innovation. Um, and what we've seen is that the two kind of travel together in the sense of when people are looking for a very different future and there's deep shared dissatisfaction with the status quo, people are very sensitive then to what are we doing to create the future that we want. And at least in the early parts of 25, we saw a huge influx of people who very much wanted a different future, but not with the chaos and cruelty that they were starting to feel. And that led to a significant curiosity about, are there better ways to thrive together? And how can we connect with those colleagues who share our desire for something very, very different, but are bringing sort of humane, democratic, civic ethos into the practice so that you're not hurting, people and causing chaos. And so in some ways, these two things can travel together and they're linked, which gives me a sense of real optimism here that the like all pieces of these futures may all be in flux at the same time. And the issue is, how do we organize the energy among people who are really willing to do something different or searching for something different? And it's a little bit of a nuance that I don't see always coming through the materials when the scenarios are cast as alternatives.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Bobby. And you're right. The scenarios are ultimately, we know that the future is going to be a combination of a number of different things, and the scenarios are just a device to kind of to push us to some corners. But as you say, it does sometimes feel as if, oh, choose which of these you want, and I think ultimately it's going to be a balance and a combination. Okay, I know we want to move on. Suzette, I'd love to get your thoughts on anything that was just presented there, and then we'll move on and go a little deeper into some of the implications for democracy funders. Suzette.
Great. Hi. I'll be very brief. I didn't participate in these sessions, but I have participated in similar ones and agree wholeheartedly with the need for them, the importance of future visions of going on offense. But one of the things that's been a persistent, sticky problem is you can do these sessions, but then people return to organizations that are not designed with this ethos in mind. And so it gets beaten out of you, right? So you have an epiphany or a new way of thinking, and then it doesn't work in the way you do your grant write-ups, or the way you have to prove immediate impact, or you have to measure things that can't be measured. And I've been frustrated because I've been on this soapbox now for several years. And I realized that there are a lot of barriers we don't even recognize that make it
Mhm.
impossible, even if people want to think this way. The culture in their organizations prevents them from thinking this way, right? The culture of philanthropy, the way board members perhaps expect grants to be presented, impact to be measured. So I think if we're going to succeed, and I really want us to, I think we absolutely have to tackle the fact that most foundations don't have a high appetite for risk, or they don't want to experiment, or they, right? So I think these things all go together with the visioning and like our aspirations for democracy. But it's really hard to do this deep work. And then people go back and there's nowhere for it to go. Or it, like I said, it gets beaten out of them. So I just wanted to make that kind of mega point because that's been one of my personal biggest frustrations in trying to advance this work over the last few years is yeah, it's just hard to make it stick.
Yeah, no, Suzette, thank you. And in some ways, as you say, we probably focused on individual capacity building, but you're raising it's as important, if not more, to really think about organizational capacity building. Otherwise, you know that it's really tough to scale it. All right. So with that, Kristen, shall I hand back over to you for the next part of this?
Absolutely. And did my screen come back up okay?
We got it.
Wonderful. So what we want to do now is we want to take us into a little bit different of an altitude. And by the way, I should say for anybody that I don't know or who doesn't know me, my name is Kristen Campbell. I serve as senior fellow at PACE and had really the honor of helping steward this project as the project leader on PACE's side. So what we want to do now is we want to take some of those reflections on the experience that Jonathan provided for us and kick it up just a notch to like, what does this really tell us about how we should be thinking about funding democracy into the future? And so, what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is give you a sneak preview of the sense that we are making on that kind of higher order level. And some of that has been teased out already in some of the brilliant comments from Emily and Bobby and Suzette, as well as Jonathan's presentation. But I want to drill down a little bit more because for a couple of reasons. Number one, this has been a collaborative learning process, and at PACE, we have a commitment to learning out loud. And so we want to learn out loud with you. We want to share our thinking with you and invite you to help us refine it and sharpen it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share 7 provocations that we're sitting with, and I'm going to ask you to sit with us in a bit of a work it out space around them. We won't be able to get into all 7 of them, but we'll pull out a couple that maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into. So here is the sneak peek of the 7 provocations. They go again a little bit deeper into what Jonathan started to outline, but really help us speak more to the challenges and difficulties and opportunities of futures techniques in democracy philanthropy. Number 1, bottom line up front. We cannot defend our way out of a crisis of imagination. We know that if democracy is to remain legitimate, it must not only defend itself, that's important, but it also must meaningfully evolve. And that means that we need to expand our imaginative capacity in addition to our technical capacity. And we tend to be a little bit better at technical than imaginative. I now want to share 3 things that we learned about the task of envisioning democracy. The first one, or number 2 of 7, is saving democracy as we know it is probably not the goal. Maybe a more fitting long-term goal should be to think about the principles that animate liberal democracy and how we pull those into the future while being a bit more open to different institutional arrangements. Next, we know that, or we're sitting with the provocation, and some of these are intuitive on the surface, but once you get under them, they're maybe not quite so intuitive, and that's part of what we want to get into. But the next one is that instead of choosing sides, we need to choose possibility. And what we think that means is that we really need better mechanisms to more honestly and accurately discern whether actions, particularly change-oriented actions, are driven by principle or if they're driven by power and a desire to hold and hoard power, and whether we can be really honest about whether those things can be held at once and if we can do both at the same time, which gets a little bit to the tension piece that Emily was talking about. And then next, change and innovation are not automatically democratic. New does not automatically mean better, nor does it automatically mean it's more democratic. And so going back to basics can still be an innovation. So that's something we're sitting with as well. Next, I want to share um, 3 provocations, if I can make my animation work. There we go. 3 provocations about what we learned about the process of futuring and foresight. And Jonathan started to get into these a little bit already, but again, I want to go just a smidge deeper. We learned that brainstorming is not the same as imagining, and futuring is not the same as knowing. And the cognitive capacity to move beyond incremental brainstorming, incremental thinking, and into disciplined curiosity is important. And it is not about asking what will happen, or knowing what will happen, but asking what could happen. And our cognitive capacity to make the distinctions that are really about degrees of certainty is really difficult to generate. Next, we hoped for shared positive visions, but we didn't really identify them. We've started talking about this a little bit already. For several reasons, there was a lack of coherence about what success and positivity and democratic futures might look like. I really appreciate Emily's provocation a minute ago about it actually should be hard to do that. So that might be something we need to dig into a little bit further. And then finally, we are sitting with the provocation that success, as tempting as it is to feel like we came out of this process and this project with like impact and the things that the project did. Success here is actually not about the project. It's about what people who participated in it and are learning from it do later. And so it's about what we believe that what is carried forward is a deeper comfort with uncertainty, a stronger commitment to principled experimentation, and a shared understanding that we actually do have the agency and ability to influence the future. So those are our kind of 7 high-level provocations. Now we're going to go into the work it out space. We don't have time to go through all 7 of those in detail. So we wanted to pull out 3 that we want to engage with you more deeply on. We chose some of them that are maybe a little counterintuitive or perhaps a little spicy in some ways, and will hopefully provoke some valuable discussion, maybe some points of agreement and generation, maybe some points of divergent perspectives. That's really what we want to try to work out for you. And so what I'm going to do in each of these is I'm going to highlight some of the key points and premises that underline each of those provocations. I'm going to ask Shannon to give us an example from the experience that will illustrate like how and why we landed with that provocation. And then we want to invite your reactions and responses. So I hope that sounds good to folks. So the first one that I want to dig into is we cannot defend our way out of a crisis of imagination. I'm going to also start by saying I acknowledge that I am about to show you a slide that has a lot of text on it, and that is really bad deck design. I know that, I get that, and I'm sorry. But I chose to do it anyway because I want you to kind of have these points of larger context for visual reference as we engage in discussion. So, key points that kind of underlie this provocation for us. One is that the dominant posture of the field, as has been articulated already, is reactive, short-term, and largely focused on elections. And that work matters deeply, but it usually does not expand our sense of what democracy could be. Next, we as a field are, generally speaking, not very well practiced in generating alternatives. And as Shannon said at the top, the risk to democracy, the greatest risk to democracy is not necessarily authoritarianism alone. It is the assumption that the only futures available to us feel like small tweaks on the present. And finally, we need to expand our imaginative capacity, not just our technical capacity. And the implication of this is that maybe foresight should be a key component of what we consider to be field infrastructure. So that's just a little bit of underneath the surface of what we mean when we say this. And so what I want to do in the work it out space, and I'll turn it over to Shannon in just a second, but what I want to sit with you with in this work it out space is really these questions of like, how would the field actually be different? Like, what would it actually mean for futures and foresight to be treated as key infrastructure? How would the field be different? What would that look like? I also want to test an assumption that you would want that the field should be building imaginative capacity in your organization. Like that's certainly an assumption and a belief that we hold. Is that something that you want to do? Do you want to build that capacity? And what would it take for you to be able to do it? So I'll pause there. Shannon, as folks are thinking about these provocations and the work it out questions, do you want to give us just maybe one quick example of like something that happened in the project that like really crystallized this for you or for us?
Yep, I'd be happy to. And actually, I'd like to give two different examples because I think they really illustrate the points that we're trying to make. So the first is during this process, we ran two different exercises where we asked participants what they think the field is funding and where they think the preponderance of democracy resources are going. Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. And both of these exercises, in one case, people were literally voting with their bodies. People thought somewhere between 75 and 90% of resources for democracy were focused on Horizon 1 work. When we then asked, what do you think would be a better distribution or the ideal distribution? Folks said they thought it should be roughly 50-50. So 50% Horizon 1 and the remaining 50% going to Horizon 2 and 3. So that was consistent across two different groups and two different exercises that we ran. The second that I thought was really interesting, and this goes to a point that Jonathan made earlier about all of the changes that were afoot during the spring, is we had Soren Dayton and Marcy Harris, Soren from Niskanen Center and Marcy from Popbox Foundation, talk about what an unprecedented moment of transformation we were experiencing in terms of our governing institutions at a national level. And the thing that they really wanted us to reflect on was we will not return to a previous state. And they said those who acknowledge the new reality first will shape the future. The question now is what will be built in its place? We need to develop new governance models suited for 21st century challenges. And they were really encouraging us to seize this moment of transformation and change in order to do the hard work of imagining what we want to come next. And it was very, very difficult for folks to do that. And the suggestion was there's just not enough effort going into that. So those are just two examples of how we arrived at this overarching conclusion and these key points.
Great. So let's open it up for about 10 minutes. Let's open it up and engage in this work it out space together. What reactions do you have to this generally? We'd be fascinated to hear. But in particular, what would it look like to make futures and foresight key infrastructure? And what would it take for you to build the capacity in your organization to do it?
And I just want to note that both Emily and Suzette said things in the previous section, which I am really thinking about in the context of these questions. Both that it might not be only about our limitations to imagine, but this is just wired to be difficult. And then also, Suzette's provocation that it's not about individual capacity, but it might also be about organizational cultural change and how difficult that is. So just wanting to acknowledge that you all have already made some challenging points that we might want to consider in this work it out space.
All right, David.
Hello, friends. David Martinez from Vitalis House Foundation in Arizona. I kind of wanted to respond initially to something you just mentioned, Shannon, from the previous session about trying to kind of not go back to a previous institution and think forward about what things could be or what not. And I'm sitting with that because I feel like philanthropy, especially, has had a lot of great opportunities to do so recently, um, where we had the opportunity to think differently about philanthropy. And we did do things different in philanthropy, but immediately went back to how it was before. I'm talking about the pandemic.
Mm,
So during the pandemic, philanthropy got rid of most of their rules and moved a ton of money very, very quickly in different mechanisms that decentralized power, that removed the existing barriers and power structures that existed to meet the need and meet the moment rapidly. And then we're out of the pandemic now and we're kind of back to the same old, same old. So I always and I am I try not to be one of those people that's like, oh, let's go back kind of thing. But in that instance, I'm like, well, we had this opportunity where we were proving that we could do things differently and we didn't.
mhm,
So I'm kind of struck by that. And we're talking a lot about this as health funders because we're thinking about the rebuilding of America's public health system, as well as in a different instance, more connected with democracy, around the census. So if there is a census citizenship question put onto the 2030 census in this administration with this Congress, which seems very likely. But then things flip in 2028. We have a very short window to change the structures of the census before the 2030 census goes live. So those two different examples, in addition to the pandemic, are kind of concepts where institutions have to change rapidly and then big picture, and not go back to how things were before. So just kind of wanted to throw out that as part of this provocation.
Thanks, David. Good point. And I see that Sanda put in the chat, like, you're right. Like, there were lots of mandates and constraints that were removed that were about innovation and things like that. But were they using futures and foresight tools is a fair question there too. So just want to bring that in. Suzette.
Yeah, just a very quick thing. I think, I don't know if this came up in your session, but one of the things that strikes me as one of the most powerful things about futures thinking is that it forces you to be incredibly humble about what you know and what you don't know, and to be open to the fact that many possible futures can occur, that you have a hand in helping or preventing some of those futures, but that I think to really have that kind of that tone and that sensibility be part of a foresight capacity in a foundation would require way more humility than funders typically have, right? Which has implications for adaptability, about willingness to change direction, about willingness to admit that something failed and that you need to try something else. And I think that's very linked to the culture of experimentation that you need to have in order to really live this out, as opposed to a culture of certainty, which I think the whole focus on metrics gives us this false impression of certainty. And so I know I'm going really big here, but I really feel like to do this well, you need a culture that enables you to actually have the grant making reflect the humility, reflect the moment of uncertainty. And that means trying a lot of stuff and having a lot of stuff fail, right? And then iterating and experimenting. And frankly, most foundations are not really into that, right? So, how do we socialize that that's a good thing? It's a good thing to fail and then realize that that didn't work and we learned something from that. Now we're going to try something else. So that.
Great. Thanks, Suzette. Do we have maybe one more comment or reflection on this one before we move on to the next one? Yeah, Jacob. Jacob, did you want to jump in? You came off mute and then you went back on mute. So,
Yeah, sorry, I raised my hand, but then it sounded like Lori had said something. So
oh,
my
sorry.
point of view on this is, I think, different from most folks, just in that I um, run a youth organizing group, and this is my first time being in this particular space, and so acclimating to the new language. Um, but sharing my point of view because I think one of the co-CEOs of Rhizome, we train young people how to organize and increase civic engagement, and increasingly shared vision work is a part of what we're returning back to as we build out our curriculum and try to connect the dots between the shared visions that young people have and the actions that they take. And so I think there's a few things that we would have to do to integrate this. So one is having really clear futures thinking frameworks woven into our civic education curriculum for young people. I think we would need shared visions that emerge and are constantly refreshed collectively to be able to say, okay, individually, these are our visions, but this is also what collective vision emerges, anchored specifically to the question of what the safer, happier, healthier world that young people want to live in looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. I think we would need evaluation processes that connect the dots between the actions that our young people are taking and their visions of the future. I think one of the pauses that I often have in future thinking conversations with young people is simultaneously like recognizing the value of it and then also the shorter lived experiences that our young people have um, can make it difficult to draw on historical context, and also that I think it's difficult sometimes to have conversations with people who are new to futures thinking, and especially young people, without creating a deep, deep, deep sense of agitation that makes it sometimes hard to move into action. And so having a futures thinking curriculum that enables them to connect the dots between big picture views and also the immediate work that's needed to build bridges. And then I think the last thing that comes to mind is the ability to have collective storytelling that emerges out of it as we try to build visions that are appealing and compelling, not just to the young people who are already civically inclined, but to their peers and the folks who are maybe not going to do a deep dive into building their knowledge base on purpose, but who instead are going to be impacted by impressions and by what their peers think. So I don't know how valuable that is given the specific context that we bring, but as um, a small nonprofit, that's one of the things that we've been thinking about in this space.
It's super valuable, Jacob, both because it's a very important perspective and really important points. I also love the tangibility that you brought to the question of like, these are the specific things that we would need. There was really this sense, while this project was focused largely on funders and philanthropy, there was this continuous question of like, how do we bring opportunities like this to our grantees? What would it look like to do a practitioner focused version of this? And this question that kept coming up was like, what what do our grantees actually need to be able to have the resources and the capacity and the like, would we just be putting more on their plates by asking them to do this or trying to support them in doing this? So hearing you talk about how valuable it would be for you and what you would need to do it is actually really, really helpful, particularly as Pace thinks about where we might want to go next in the space. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move us to our next provocation. And that is, of the seven, we chose change and innovation are not automatically democratic. It's one that we want to dig in a little bit on with you. And so the key points, if I can make my clicker work, and I apparently did my animation backwards. The key points is that if something about democracy is not working, not even democracy in general, when we feel like something isn't working or is working against purpose, it can be tempting for us to think that, well, then just changing it or reforming it will inherently be better and more democratic because it's different than what it is that we currently have. But it behooves us to remember that new does not automatically mean better, nor does it automatically mean more democratic. And so going back to basics and sometimes returning to first principles can still be an innovation. And this came up a little bit in some of the conversation already, but there are shadow sides associated with change, which it can include the willingness of people to want change so badly that they're willing to bend laws or bend democratic norms to achieve it, or they're willing to support leaders who are actually anti-democratic because those leaders promise I can bring change and I can bring it quickly. And so it's a well-intentioned desire in some ways that can actually have some adverse effects. And so the work it out space prompt, again, invite overall reactions to this. But the work it out space prompt that I want to talk about here is that the implication of this might be that sometimes funders need to resist the urge to seek bright, shiny new things to support. But when does saying go back to basics actually feel like, or maybe actually in reality, sit in tension with a call for imagination? When and how do these things butt up together? And I think this is a little bit of what Emily provoked us with in thinking overall. And then what indicators, when we are testing about or thinking about or experimenting, changing things or innovating with things, what indicators should we be looking to know whether those changes truly are contributing to more democratic outcomes and whether they're based in principle or whether they're based in power, which we discussed earlier. So I'll open it up. While you all are sitting with that, I'm going to turn back to Shannon again to see if you have a crystallizing or illustrative story or experience you want to share with us.
Great. I do. So I wanted to talk about an exercise that we did during workshop 3, where we looked at some innovations that are already being experimented with and talked about how they could be helpful in strengthening democracy, and also what are the potential shadow sides of those innovations or the unintended consequences or harms. So I wanted to share two. So the first are all of these highly consultative, deliberative processes that are being experimented with. On the one hand, the idea is that these kinds of processes can increase civic participation, give people a real sense that their voice is being heard and that they have a role in shaping policy decisions that affect their life. It can give them a sense of agency. It can better help connect public officials with citizens and hopefully improve trust. So, a lot of potential upsides. On the other hand, these kinds of deliberative processes can really slow things down and can exacerbate some of the problems that we're already seeing in terms of government delivering for the people. And this idea is really at the root of some of the critique of the abundance agenda, which is that investing so much power in local entities and having all of these opportunities for people to have bites at the apple has made things slow to the point of paralysis. So that was one example. Another example was on this innovation that is being promoted, which is outcomes-based legislation. So the idea being that we should really focus legislation on what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and worry less about the how. So a lot of legislation, as you all know, gets into minute detail about who's going to do what. So, on the one hand, this kind of approach can help us focus more on achieving results, which oftentimes there's a lot of focus on the how and the money that's appropriated, but we don't actually ever see the outcomes that we are trying to achieve through legislation. So, it could help solve for that and create more accountability and, in an ideal way, create less opportunities for regulatory capture. On the other hand, there was a concern that without a blueprint for how do we get to that outcome, there was the risk of having a tyranny of experts be the ones who really fill the gaps and really creating another kind of class of elites who are the ones that are helping sort all of these things out. There was also, as Kristen alluded to, a concern about the risk of causing harms and potentially breaking a lot of China and, and hurting people in ways that maybe were not anticipated in the pursuit of these results or aims. So, just two examples of how things that appear on the surface as bright, new, shiny ideas could actually have some downsides that need to be considered.
So let's open it up. Small questions to work out together. What do you all think? How does this land with you? And where and how is the perception or the reality of innovation and imagination and tension with each other? And is there consensus to Mike's question in the chat? Is there consensus about what more democratic means and how we measure it? Emily.
Yeah, obviously, I love this provocation. You know me. So maybe in going to the question in the chat from Mike, it I'm wondering if the provocation really isn't something more like change and innovation are not automatically moving us toward a liberal democracy. Because I think sometimes when we use words like democracy and democratic, we're already importing in our own heads that it's liberal democracy that we what we mean. And I think the provocation and the stories that, and at least a couple of the stories that you're alluding to, Shannon, I think point us to the challenge of sometimes the change we want to see, if we don't carry in the how, well, what we're saying is that like we want this thing to happen, but it's by any means necessary, and that like it's almost like we're opening the door to that kind of thinking, and the word liberal challenges that, and I think it means it has a lot more precise meaning than democracy does, and or liberal helps to rein in what we mean by democracy. So I think that's the challenge that we're pointing to. Tell me if it's not, but it seems to me like the the how, the liberality of any change we're seeing is really the how question. Like are we still adhering to principles that have appropriate constraints on executive power, for example? So to me, maybe the provocation is more about, are the changes liberal, or the innovations leading us in a direction of a more liberal democracy? Maybe that's what's needed in the provocation.
It's a really interesting point, Emily. And one of the things that I struggled with in summarizing some of these is just how closely related some of these provocations actually are to each other. So even though it's one we didn't go deep in today, the point, some of the key points underlining the saving democracy is probably not the goal provocation are really about, because maybe we're actually trying to pull forward liberalism. Maybe what we're trying to save is liberalism, and we need to really be focusing on pulling those principles forward and being potentially a little bit more open to other institutional or structural arrangements about how liberalism is best achieved. So definitely more to discuss there, but it's related closely to some of the other provocations that we're sitting with. Mike, do you want to jump in?
Well, just a quick comment. I I think the Gallup Kettering report that just came out lifted up again the problem with, the younger generation. I'll leave that just generally stated. Um, Continues to put less weight on the importance and democracy as a when it's polled. We keep seeing that showing up. It showed up in your reports. Um, and it keeps showing up. And Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I don't know. I don't follow that a show religiously, but I did catch this. I think this week's episode. And I don't know if they rerun that all week, but they did a segment on capitalism and really explored, and they really hit the important point about how capitalism and democracy get conflated with each other. And I think a lot of the younger generation who are being pulled to an alternative of from our democracy are really and being pulled towards, socialism as we've seen, in New York City. I think the younger generation is more focused. I think their issue is more focused on what's happening with wealth inequality and the American dream, and more on the capitalism part of the equation. And again, they're just lumping the two together and blaming it on democracy. So it sort of is along the same lines of what you were just talking about, liberal democracy. But anyway, I'd encourage people to chase down that segment. It's a short but interesting discussion.
Great. Mike, if you want to share a link to it, if you have it and you want to put a link to it in the chat, I welcome you
Yeah,
to
I'll
do
see if
that.
I can find it.
Great, thanks. I see Kelly and Nick, and then we're going to move on to the next one.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore the point, Emily, that you made. I think that it is the conversation about the liberalism part that is often missing. And we just today with our staff, there's a whole learning series around sort of a global anti-rights movement, has been the framing for that internally. And it's, I think, one that has landed problematically for a lot of people because it's well, I'll spare everyone the details on that one, but I think it's this question about the protection of minority rights component of liberalism
Pardon?
that is actually
If you
under threat.
want. You just want.
Um, and so I think grappling with that requires grappling with a bunch of different kinds of questions than if we just say democracy.
Really? Nick.
Yeah, thank you. I'll piggyback on a similar sentiment. I think pushing on what Emily's talking about here, one of the challenges I've often seen is, and I think it's consistent with this question of like we struggle with, is innovation and imagination like always net positive, right? Or how should we think about those things? And it can be. My overarching concern, or I think framework that's helpful, like Emily's pointing out, like maybe indexing on liberalism is maybe the way to avoid certain questions, or certain challenges. I might also offer that it's like I think the democracy is a process, right? I think the virtue is found in the process, not the outcomes that it delivers. And oftentimes, I think that's where we can get bound up with like innovation and imagination is delivering a thing, right? Like better, like it could solve for inequality, it could solve for different outcomes that people are struggling with. Alternatively, I think if you optimize towards what makes the process itself more consistent with liberal democratic values. Now, that might not deliver outcomes that everyone's happy about in all instances, in many instances, actually. But it's the mechanism by which we can agree upon like the virtue of the process. And it sort of skirts around this question of is imagination and innovation like always a move forward? It may or may not be, but I think as long as it's consistent with like, hey, let's index on the virtue of the process and not the outcomes itself, is I think another way, in the same way that Emily's pointing out that liberalism maybe is a helpful framing point. Like process over outcome might also be a way to think about it. And that doesn't make like innovation or imagination good or bad in that instance. It just means it has to be oriented towards the thing that is universally valuable. Whereas like an outcomes focused can run the risk of like, hey, that might not be optimal for all people. It might actually be working us backwards in certain instances for certain demographics. And so I think just offering that that framing, in the same way liberalism can be helpful, I think is helpful to anchor a larger coalition around what the ideal state is, whether or not that's harkening back to a process that was better in the past or whether it's about reimagining that process.
Yeah, fascinating. And that's actually a great tee up to the question of how do we envision what and get consensus on what better is, because the next and the last provocation that I want to invite us to spend a little work it out time in together is the realization that we really hoped and set out an aspiration for having shared positive visions, for identifying shared positive visions, and we didn't necessarily get it in the way that we might have hoped. Doesn't mean we didn't get some, but not in the way that we might have hoped. And so I guess I really just said this first point, which is that we had an aspiration to do it, and we also intentionally brought together a diverse and divergent group. That doesn't mean that there weren't still dominant leanings or dominant, identities, characteristics within the group, but the group was pretty diverse and divergent in lots of ways. And in some ways, and we talked about this a little bit already, there was not necessarily coherence about what success or what positivity in a democratic future might entail. And whether that's a feature or a bug is an important thing to sit with. Next, Jonathan talked about this a bit, but some futures that we thought might be net positive felt aspirational to the point of implausibility, or like they were actually more of partisan or ideological wish lists rather than truly meaningful shared destinations. And just a reflection on the process, and Jonathan talked a little about this already too, but the time, space, and cognitive openness required for the rigor of this work is really difficult under even the best circumstances. And it was particularly challenging amid current pressures and demands on funders' time. And so there's this really inherent paradox in the things that lead us to need this work the most are also the things that make it the hardest for us to carve out the space for it. And so, what I'd love to sit in a work it out space with you all around is hearing from you all. Have you had success generating shared visions within divergent groups? What design choices contributed to your ability to do that? And were there ways that you finally got to a point where you could say, okay, we have enough agreement here to push forward. And I ask this not only for our benefit, but two other donor networks have told us that they plan to replicate a version of this project with their members. And one of them is even on the call today. And so we want this learning to help inform, not only our reflections, but some of the design choices and the ways of structuring that folks might want to take forward in their own work. So let's open it up on this one. While folks are thinking, Shanna, do you want to jump in with a specific pin point to put on this?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest marker of this one was the fact that we had created those four scenarios. Two were supposed to be mostly positive, and two were supposed to be mostly negative or dystopian. And even the positive ones, there were people who were like, that's not really a future that I want to embody. There were things about those positive futures that were not only implausible, but didn't really resonate with people. On the flip side of that, there were certain aspects of the dystopian futures that did appeal to people. So if you take the network state one, for example, a lot of participants had concerns about the overwhelming surveillance, but the idea that things would run very well and their environment would be very clean and they could get reliable services from the governments, um, kind of on demand was very appealing. And so it just really speaks to, I think, different people want different things in the future, and the more diverse the group, the harder it is to land on a shared positive vision.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Lori, let's start with you.
Sure. So we do fund this work. We have a project that is working with communities that to come up with solutions with participants from all sides of the political spectrum. And the thing that is most, I guess, insightful, I guess, is that it takes a lot of time.
Mm.
And the more time you take, the better your outcome. So you might think, oh, we'll give a year for this project, but it might take 2 years or 3 years. So, and if you don't stick with it, you're not you're not going to reach your goal. And I think that's really an important thing to recognize. And I think we're not built for taking chances. I think that's a real problem. But when you're doing futures thinking, you have to.
Mm. Yeah. One thing you're really underscoring here, Lori, is something we talk about at PACE a lot is the importance of relational infrastructure and how much you need to build trust with people for its own sake before you can even ask people to engage in things. And like it was always ambitious. We knew that it was ambitious and aspirational to set out with this goal. But to think that we could do it in 4 workshops without, like, there was a lot of good faith and there was a lot of goodwill, and there still needed to be more relational infrastructure and more trust, I think, to get people to the place that they could engage in finding some shared coherence. So it's a really important reflection. Thank you for sharing. Others? Yeah, Tom. Hi.
Um, hey, to share that in parallel, started much later in this process. Um, I have been working with Press Forward on scenario development and then having folks associated with Press Forward, both grantees and other funders, engage with those scenarios and then start asking themselves, what are they doing on horizons 1, 2, and 3? Has it generated a shared vision? Uh, is a We have scenarios. I think we are yet to understand if there will be buy-in to a clear path forward. What I think for those people who've been more deeply engaged, it has made people realize that the status quo action will lead to a status quo that is not particularly motivating. And that is it's not getting us to the point of a positive outcome yet, but it is moving. It's a step along that path. And I think that's when I look at this, it's what is it that helps move us forward? There's technical capacity. In the earlier slide, there was narrative capacity, practice, people who are willing to do this. But in the current context where to the Soren Dayton quote you used, where going back isn't an option. It's sort of, this is where we are doing what we can. So yeah, that's my experience from West Forward.
Thank you, Tom. We probably have time for one more comment or reflection before I turn it over to Shannon to talk about what's next and close us out. Anybody want the final word? Right. Well, thank you so much for your willingness to engage with us today through over the course of this project. It has truly been a collective and collaborative journey. We know that none of us hold all the answers. We all hold a lot of aspiration and desire to move forward in ways that will make democracy more liberal, small L liberal, and deliver and create better outcomes for our country. So thank you all so much for your engagement today, your engagement over the course of the last 18 months. And I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to talk about what PACE is thinking about next.
Thank you, Kristen. You've been such a masterful facilitator and project lead for this whole thing. We're just so very grateful to you and to the whole team for getting us to this point. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. In terms of next steps, the simplest one is that we're going to publish our executive summary and project wrap up next week. We thought we nearly had that nailed down, but based on a lot of the conversations today, I think there's some more revisions that need to be made. So we will get that out to folks next week. And this is just part of our commitment to make sure that we're sharing everything that we have learned and gained from this experience with the broader public. In addition to the workshop summaries and this final wrap up, there's a toolkit that we developed so that folks can replicate this experience. So we really are trying to capacitate the field. So please be on the lookout for that. The second thing is that this conversation has really underscored that as far as we came together on really building our ability to engage in this future-oriented way of thinking, we still have some ways to go in translating those skills to our actual strategies and great making practices. Um, I really appreciate what Suzette was saying earlier about the challenges of coming back with this enthusiasm and with these relationships and with these new skill sets and wanting to put them into action and coming up against the reality in a lot of institutions. So, what we want to do to continue to help funders is to set up a structured, facilitated learning lab where we will have a chance to continue to support you all, and you all will have a chance to support one another as we try to take these skills and these lessons and put them into practice. So, the kinds of things that we can talk about and work out together in this learning lab are: how do we write an effective RFP for Horizon 3 work? How do we evaluate proposals? What are we going to do about metrics? Because we know that people want to be able to measure things. And when we're talking about Horizon 3 work, that becomes very challenging. How do we convince our leadership and our boards that this is a worthwhile endeavor? Those are the kinds of things that we want to create a space for funders to work out together. So we're looking at having that learning lab set up early in 2026 and would very much like to hear from you if you want to be a part of that effort. So Siri, oh, she already has. Siri has put into the chat my calendar link. If you're interested in taking this conversation forward and are at least intrigued about the idea of being part of this learning lab, please do book time with me to talk through it. It's not a commitment, but we want to make sure that we're capturing your interest. And then the final thing that we are looking to do is to establish a pooled fund to support capacity building at a state level within state level coalitions and organizations to do this future oriented work. As we heard earlier, there is a real desire on behalf of young people, grassroots organizations, individuals who are working on democracy and civic engagement and civic life and want to contribute to this country and want to think about what does democracy look like for the next 250 years. But this is a particular skill set and a particular capacity, as we all learned. And so we want to set up a pooled fund so that we can help resource organizations at the state level with future fellows and with the ability to do this visioning. And we're trying to accelerate that process and make it far more efficient by setting up this pool fund rather than having each individual organization have to do their own fundraising to bring on board this capacity. So those are just a couple of ideas in terms of where PACE is going with this work. We want to make sure that we do not lose momentum. As I said, I think we've gone a long way in people buying into the idea that it is important to be engaging in Horizon 3 and that these are important capacities. But it is clear that we need to continue to work together and to support one another to really put these strategies into practice. And at PACE, we want to be a partner to you on that. So please do reach out to me and I can hang on for another 3 minutes if anybody has any questions or wants to ask or wants to express interest in doing that. But if not, we're really so grateful for your attention, for your participation, and for being partners in this work.